So we want to be very deliberate about how we take Jesus into the community, how important it is that we love first, how we strive to be the light in the darkness. You know, there's just so much going on in our world today, so much chaos. I think we can really see the church, the mission God's calling to be so critical to what we're doing.
Well, how many of you are country music fans? Come on, I want to see your hands. Be proud that you're a country music fan. Come on, get those hands up. Like, look around. All of you country music fans. Well, I am not. I actually despise country music. And I say that to people, and then they try to convince me that, no, I'm wrong. I'm like, no, I really don't like country music. Now, there's a few artists out there that I like Johnny Cash. Yeah, I will slide him into that category where I'll listen to Johnny Cash. But most country music artists, I'm just not a fan of. Well, there's one that I do like. And I know some of you, like really hardcore country music fans, will mock me for this because you slide this artist into the non-country music category. But 3 decades ago, he came out with his second album. It was titled No Fences. And for some of you, you know who I'm talking about right away. On that album, he had the classic songs like Thunder Rolls and Friends in Low Places. But he had this other song. It was a slower song on that album that tells this story about a guy that goes back, as an adult, goes back to his high school, and he sees his high school sweetheart, and he's just thankful for unanswered prayers, that he didn't marry his high school sweetheart, that he married his now wife. At the very end of this song, the lyrics go like this: some of God's greatest gifts are too often unanswered. Some of God's greatest gifts are unanswered prayers. Do you have a prayer or 2 or 5 that you're thankful that God didn't answer? Do you have a request that you asked of God, and I don't know, a month, a year, 3 decades later, you're just thankful that God said, well, no, or God was just quiet? I know I do. And in the series, 800-Pound Gorilla, we're following the storyline of a guy named Elijah. In this third part, we're going to look at a moment that, well, Elijah is going to ask something from God, and later on in his life, well, he's going to be thankful that God didn't answer that request. As we've made our way through this series, there's a kind of 3-step cycle that, well, you and me fall into. This cycle is something that, well, for all of us, we just need to pay attention to and be intentional to, well, break the cycle. You see, in part 1, we looked at Elijah seeing God's power rain down with fire. A cloud came in with rain, and then God's power came on him. He ran all the way to Jezreel. And Elijah, it was kind of a mountaintop experience to see God's power in 3 very real ways. And then he receives a note from a messenger from the evil Queen Jezebel that basically said, by tomorrow you're going to die. And just the thought of the threat that she was going to come after him caused him to, well, the text tells us, to run in fear. He, well, escaped. And all of us have escape mechanisms. And we looked at those in part 2, the different ways that we escape. The question is, do you recognize how you choose to escape? And then we went on in part 2 and we looked at what Elijah did next, and something that you and, well, I do too. This is what we do next. When we're escaping, we isolate. For Elijah, he left his assistant, his servant, and Beersheba, and then he continued on into the desert. And for us, sometimes we physically isolate like Elijah did, and sometimes we mentally isolate. We fall into these isolation traps that gets tied to our thoughts. And all of this leads to, the third step of the cycle. Now, I'm not going to reveal what that is yet. We'll get there quickly. But I will give you 2 clues. For some of you, you want to figure it out because having a blank box is going to drive you nuts. So here's the 2 clues I'm going to give you. First clue is this. It rhymes with escape and isolate. Now, let's pause there. Yes, it rhymes. Now, when I shared this with my wife, Kim, she disagreed with me. In fact, she started texting people to try to tell me I was wrong, and she got the people that aligned with her. But I just want you to know, it does rhyme, which leads to the second clue, and it's a picture. Do you know what it is? Like I said, we'll get there in just a few short moments. So Elijah, in part 2, where we left off in the story, is he's left his servant in Beersheba, and he's wandered south into the desert another day's journey. And what we're told is that he came to a boom bush, and he sat underneath it. He needed to escape the desert, the wilderness heat. He sat down, and we're told that he prayed. Now remember again, Elijah, what was his job? Prophet. What was the job description? To go where God told him to go, to say everything God had him to say. I mean, Elijah was handpicked by God to be his messenger, to be his spokesperson. So Elijah, again, we human beings do this. We put people on a list and on a scale, and we shove people up in a hierarchy and shove them down. Like, we do this all the time. And Elijah, well, he's one of these people in the Bible that he's way high on the list of importance throughout not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well. So what do you think Elijah prayed for? This holy man of God, this messenger of God, this person that, just saw God's power in 3 very specific ways. What do you think he prayed for? Well, remember, he's in the cycle. He's escaping, now he's isolating, and this leads to, the third step in the cycle. You know what he prayed for? He prayed that he might die. In fact, his prayer went like this: Dear God, I've had enough. I'm tapping out. I'm up to here. No more. I mean, this is just where Elijah, a prophet of God, is at. He is just done. And he's saying to God, I want out. God, I want out. God, find someone else. Pick someone else. I don't know what you want to do with me, but I've had enough. Here's my question for you. Are you there right now? You just had enough. And you're saying to God, it's too much. The weight's too heavy. The fear, the anxiety in my life is just overwhelming. You think about work, I've had enough. You think about family relationships, you've had enough. You think about friendship relationships, I've had enough. You think about church, I've had enough. You think about all the things going on in the world, you've had enough. You think about your finances, I've had enough. You think about anything swirling in your life, and I've had enough. And here's what you need to hear from me. I've been there. I completely understand. In fact, when I read the story of Elijah, I've been there before. Hey, God, I've given you all of me. Hey, God, I have faithfully followed you. Hey, God, no matter what you've asked from me, I've said yes, and I'm just now done. I'm ready to tap out. I've had enough. Elijah's just there. It's real. And I know that you know what that feels like, don't you? Elijah goes on, he goes, hey, God, just take my life. Just take it. I'm no good to you. I'm no good for you. In fact, I'm no better than my ancestors. See, all of this leads to this third step of the cycle. Did you figure out what this word is? Remember, it rhymes. It really does. The third step is the word ruminate. Now, this is a great word. I love the word ruminate. And you might be thinking, what? Does it rhyme? It does rhyme. Some of you know it does rhyme. Some of you are going to disagree with me. That's okay. Some of you are thinking, well, how does that tie into this picture? Well, if you're familiar with cows, especially cute ones like, well, I named it Bessie. Cows are in the line of a certain type of animals that ruminate. What does that mean? Maybe you've heard of it phrased this way, chewing their cud. It's what they do. They eat food, they chew it, they swallow it, they puke it back up, chew it again, swallow it, and just repeat the cycle. Some experts say that cows can spend 35 to 40% of their day ruminating. That's disgusting when you think about it. I love eating beef, don't get me wrong, but just thinking that that's what a cow does 35 to 40% of the day, aren't you glad God didn't create us human beings to do that? Because that would make dinner conversations really, really disgusting. But that's what ruminating is. But there's a second definition to ruminating. It's the same thing, except with our mind, with our thoughts. You see, we do that with our thoughts, don't we? We think about something, we swirl it around in our brain, we puke it back up into our brain, and we swirl it around again, don't we? Over and over and over again. I mean, you're going to see this in Elijah's story as we move into part 4 into part 5. He's just going to continue to ruminate. In the counseling world, there's something called the CBT triangle. Now, what's interesting about the CBT triangle is I wasn't really familiar with it. In fact, I didn't even know what CBT was until, Ben, who leads our Grampian church, and I were on a podcast with Chelsea Brown, and all 3 of those podcasts right now are available, so go to tcconline.tv and you can watch those, and I would highly recommend you watch them. Chelsea is amazing at explaining and giving some great direction and help when it comes to mental health. But in one of those podcasts, she started talking about the CBT triangle, and I just asked her, I'm like, Chelsea, what does CBT stand for? And she goes, well, it stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. And she's talking about this triangle. And she talked about this triangle. I got this big smile on my face. You see, during my summer study break, I wrote about 49, 50 pages for this entire 800-pound gorilla series. It was a rough draft, a rough script, a lot more work to do on it, but that's how much I wrote. And as she was describing what this triangle was, all of a sudden I was like, Chelsea, I have this in my notes for part 3, but I had no clue the name of it. It was just an intuitive side to me of what I go through. It just was one of those ideas as I was thinking through our thoughts and ruminating, like this is just what happens in my life. She goes, yeah, everyone does this. And this is what the triangle is. Your thoughts influence your emotions or your feelings, which influence your behavior. That's it. That's the CBT triangle. It's because you just have to understand that your thoughts, what goes around in your mind, will influence your emotions, what you feel, which will direct your behavior, your actions, what you do. You see, it all starts in our mind. And we got to pause on that for a moment. Because researchers have discovered that the average human mind every day has some 12,000 to 60,000 thoughts. Now that's a big spread of numbers. Like, I get that, right? But here's the thing. It depends on personality. It depends on age. It depends on what you do. I mean, there's a whole lot of factors in there. But what they do know is there's somewhere between 12 to 60,000 thoughts that you have every single day. Now, that's a big number. But here's the two kind of specific data points that we got to really lean into. It's two percentages. The percentages? 95 and 80%. You see, what researchers have discovered is that 95% of our thoughts are repetitive. Same thoughts over and over and over and over again. You talk about ruminating, right? That is what ruminating, over and over and over again, which makes the second percentage so dangerous. Out of all your thoughts, my thoughts, 80% of those thoughts they're negative. No wonder mental health. No wonder why we're all just exhausted mentally, emotionally. No wonder why we're all struggling. 80% of our thoughts are negative. You see, we think about the CBT triangle. We think about our thoughts that influence our emotions, that influence our behavior. It's why our thoughts are so important and why we have to break the cycle of escaping to isolating, because those two steps always lead to ruminating. There's a verse that we've looked at in each part of this series. It's this verse in 2 Corinthians, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. That's why every thought is so critical. Every thought is critical. You see, the question that you got to have to kind of roll around in your spirit is, what are your thoughts fixed to? What thoughts do you need to take captive and just toss away? What thoughts do you need to take captive and make obedient to Jesus? And that question leads to the next one. What percentage of your thoughts are negative? 80% is the average. Some people have a higher percentage, some have a lower, right? 80% is average. What percentage of your thoughts every day are negative? Which leads to, how do you break the cycle? And maybe a different way to ask this question that doesn't feel as good is, do you want to break the cycle? Do you want to? You see, the Bible over and over and over again talks about our mind. It's quite amazing. When you kind of pause and you start thinking through, the Bible and our mind. Because God knows. He created us, that our thoughts influence our emotions, influences our behavior. God understands it all. That's why over and over again, God comes back to our thoughts, our minds, and that we need to take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. The Apostle Paul also wrote these words in a letter he wrote to a church located in the ancient city of Philippi. And he wrote this. He goes, "Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is, ... He says, hey, whatever. And then he's going to give 6 very specific kind of categories, words that we need to keep in view. And after he gets done with this, these 6 very specific words, 6 very specific categories, he said, hey, think about these things. He goes, this is where you need to focus your thoughts. If you're going to ruminate, this is where you should ruminate. If you're going to have these thoughts going over and over again in your mind, this is where you should keep those thoughts. You should make every thought obedient to Christ. And here's 6 very specific things that you should ruminate on. And if you do, you're going to see that 80% negative thought average start to decrease. The first one that Paul says, he said, whatever is true. Now, here's what's interesting about, things that are true. There's capital T truths and lower T truths. The capital T truths is actually what is true. But we are experts and very gifted at, taking lower T truths and convincing ourselves that they're capital T truths. A lower T truth is a statement like this: I'm not good enough. Maybe that's yours. Maybe you were raised in a setting where you could never measure up. You can never be good enough. And so you just literally think to yourself, I'm just not good enough, or I will never measure up. 2 different ways of saying the same thing. Maybe for you, you're sitting there and you're just like, God won't forgive me. God can't forgive me. I mean, you're thinking through all the things that you have done in your life, and you're just like, God won't, God can't. I've done too much. That's a lower T truth. It's not true, but you've convinced yourself it is true. Maybe for you, your lower T truth is, everyone will hurt me. So you're living in isolation because you've convinced yourself that everyone, have people hurt you? Yes. Everyone? And maybe you have deep wounds from people, and that's real. I'm not making light of that. All I'm saying is, you've convinced yourself, which has empowered you to live in isolation, which only intensifies your ruminating thoughts. Maybe for you, it's I'm a failure. And here's the interesting thing with failure. Yes, granted, maybe you have failed, but that doesn't mean you're a failure. A capital T truth is you failed before. I failed before. That's a capital T truth. You've tried something, it's failed. A relationship failed. A dream that you thought was going to come into fruition, it didn't, it failed, right? Capital T truth, you failed. But the lower T truth says, I'm a failure. No, you're not a failure, because God created you. God didn't create a failure. And some of the greatest breakthroughs come from you failing. And God's like, yeah, learn from that. I have something great for you. We could keep going on these. The question is, what small T truths are holding you captive? Paul goes on, and he goes, whatever is noble. That word noble, it can mean honorable, or it can mean worthy of respect, or it could mean elevated. And I love the word elevated because, that's how we should think of our thoughts. Whatever is noble. Let me ask you this question. What if my thoughts became public? What if all of a sudden every thought you had in your brain went out on Twitter, or written on a movie screen, was sent out in an email to your friends, your boss, your coworkers? Paul's like, hey, whatever is noble, the thoughts that are elevated, not in the gutter. You see, just because you think it, just because the thought comes in your mind, doesn't mean you should say it. So many times, I'm like, why did you text that? Why did you post that? Believe you me, there's been many a text message or email or social media posts that I've wanted to post. I mean, it was going to be good. I was going to get back at that person. I was going to be so underhanded. I was going to give a left hook. I mean, they were good, but not noble. Not noble. And then I took a deep breath and I'm like, hey, God, how would you respond? What would you type? What would you say? Then Paul writes the next one. He goes, whatever is right. What does right mean? Well, it's worthy of God's approval. It's conforming to God's standards. That's what right means. That God has a bar set. For you and me, we like to compare ourselves to other people, don't we? Well, at least I don't. At least I'm not like. At least I'm. And God's like, no. You don't compare yourself to anyone else. I'm the bar. And God's like, hey, whatever's right. And God's like, I'm setting the standard for what right is. Which leads to this question. Does God approve of the thought? Could you imagine if you took every thought through that filter? Hey, God, do you approve of that? Before you sent that text message, hey, God, do you approve of that? Before you posted that on social media, hey, God, do you approve of that? Before you respond to a friend, a coworker, a spouse, a child, hey, God, do you approve of that? I mean, just think about that as a filter. And that's what Paul's saying. Hey, whatever's right, God's standard, that's the bar. He goes on, he goes, whatever is pure. And this is all about moral purity in relationship to God. Again, not to each other. We're not each other's moral purity standard. God's saying, I'm the standard. I'm what holiness looks like. So this leads to this question. Does that thought reflect God's holiness? When that thought comes in your mind, God's standard, does it reflect God's holiness? And he says, whatever is, well, lovely. Lovely. Another way to say lovely is pleasing or acceptable or attractive. I mean, wrap that around some of your thoughts. Which leads to this question. Does that thought attract people to me? Think about that. Not in a weird, attractional way. Does that thought cause people to lean into me? Does that thought cause people to want to know who I really am? And more specifically, does that thought reflect who Jesus is? And then Paul wrote, whatever is admirable. This simply means, well, not likely to offend. Whew. Are your thoughts offensive? If those thoughts got put out on the Twitter sphere, if I said that right, if those thoughts got emailed out, text out to everyone you know, how offensive would your thoughts be? Which leads to this question. Does that thought tear down or build up? Paul goes on, he goes, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. You see, this is what it looks like to take captive every thought. Every thought, and you start putting through the grid work of whatever is noble and whatever is right and whatever is pure and whatever is lovely and whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy. This is taking everything thought captive and making it obedient to Jesus. And Paul goes, hey, whatever you've learned or received or heard from me or seen in me. Paul's saying, hey, look at my life. Was Paul perfect? No. Paul authentically talks about his struggle with sin, how a wretched man that he was. I mean, Paul was real. But he goes, hey, look at my life. This is what I'm pursuing. This is a life starting with my thoughts that influence my behavior, that influence my emotions, that influence my behavior. This is what I'm committed to. He goes, so you've seen me live this out. And then his encouragement for me and for you. He says, well, put it into practice. Put it into practice. You got to practice this. This isn't just normal and natural. It's just not going to happen. You got to be intentional and say, okay, God, I'm going to think about the things that are true. Capital T truths, not the lower T truth things, the capital T truth things. God, whatever is noble and whatever is right and whatever is pure and lovely and admirable. Hey, God, these are the things I'm going to practice with my thoughts, because I know my thoughts will influence my emotions, my feelings, which will influence my behaviors, my actions, what I do. Hey, God, I'm going to practice these things. Why? Because I want to take every thought captive and make it obedient to your Son, Jesus. And then Paul ends, says, and the God of peace will be with you. Peace comes from thinking about these things. I've shared with you that we have some great resources for you. I mentioned a few moments ago that Ben, who leads our Grampian church, and I recorded a 3-episode podcast with a counselor, Chelsea Brown. That's live on our website now, and just part of a collection of different resources for you. But I want to encourage you, because she helps breaks down some very complex thoughts when it comes to our mental health and gives some great direction on how to navigate through this. So I want to encourage you to listen or to watch those. But right now, we wanted to create a space for you. Because if you're like me, somewhere around that 80% range of our thoughts don't reflect the heart of God. So around your campus, there's going to be some mirrors. We've provided some Sharpie markers. And during this next song, I just want to invite you to walk up. Now, for some of you, you're going to love this. For some of you, this is going to make you uncomfortable. But remember, sometimes it's a great thing for us to take a step out of our comfort zone. So we just want you, during this next song, to walk up to a mirror and fill in the blank. I am, and you choose a word. Here's some ideas. But maybe there's a different word. But focus in on the capital T truth of how God sees you. Not the lower T truth of what you've tried to convince yourself of. No. In the sight of God Almighty, the Heavenly Father, the one who created you, breathed breath into your lungs. I am. And write that word. Let me pray. And then this space is yours. Lord, right now, across all of our churches, Lord, I pray that every single person knows the value that they are to you. Lord, I pray that in this moment that they'll take captive every thought and make it obedient to your Son, Jesus. In your name I pray.